be familiar, but I promise it won't be as long. So I like to start conversations about mastery grading, talking about traditional grading, right? So maybe a student takes a test or any other assessment and they get a score, and that's great. And maybe we're told, go over the questions you got wrong and, ask me any questions, right? That was kind of the model that at least I had as a student. Um, and maybe the student, looks at the questions and they see how much they score in every question. Um, and they may or may not go over those questions. Usually the good students do, and they're probably the ones who didn't really need to go over it. And the ones who did poorly just get stuck in that cycle of, I'm not good at this, and I'm terrible, and I'm a failure, right? Um, so if we break down each question in terms of concepts, and this is from this great YouTube video that I share with my students about why I do mastery grading. Um, so the numbers up top here are the questions, and these are the concepts covered in the question. So check marks are that they got it right, and X that they got it wrong. The tilde means they got it partially correct. And so traditional grading kind of goes downward, right? It just kind of counts points. Or, oh, they did some of that, they did a little bit of that, so they got this many points. In mastery grading, you're actually looking in this table, you're looking across horizontally. So you want to understand whether does a student really recognize when forces are balanced? Can they calculate a net force? Can they attack a second law problem? So by looking across the concepts rather than the problems, you get a better sense of what the students do or do not understand, so you can get them better feedback. Right? You can tell them, hey, you understand what a balance force is, what the third law is, and maybe force of gravity, but you really need to practice drawing free body diagrams and applying the second law. And because they're struggling with that, they couldn't even attempt maybe more advanced questions or more advanced problems. So the idea here is to track concepts rather than points. And just some kind of quick definitions. There are a lot of various names for this type of grading: mastery based grading, standards based grading, outcomes based grading. There's no real actual kind of totally accepted name. Um, but you can divide it into, I would say, two categories: the mastery based grading and the specifications grading. And these two broad categories are basically determined by what the student does. So in mastery based grading, the student has to master course standards. So, they can apply Newton's second law to a mechanics problem, right? Something like that. And in specifications grading, it's more about specific assignments, and those assignments have really specific specifications, just to kind of use the word specific as much as possible in one sentence. Um, so these are really detailed requirements for each particular assignment. So the student has to meet the specifications to satisfactorily complete a particular assignment. And once they completed a certain number of assignments, or based on the number of assignments, that's how they get their grade. Now, these two are not mutually exclusive. I myself use a combination of these. So, for example, I might have a course standard on a student. I can write a lab report using the standard IMRD structure, and then the lab report has a list of specifications that they have to meet in order to satisfactorily write a lab report. In my opinion, these are the key features of mastery-based grading. You have to have a clear list of learning targets. Some people call them standards or outcomes or objectives, whatever you want to call them. Because I use Canvas, I call them outcomes because that's the language Canvas uses to track them. But the students have to be given this list, and any skills that they need, and possibly specifications if you're also doing specifications for certain assignments. The assessment is based on mastery, not points or partial credit. So basically, you set a standard that the students have to meet. That you, as the instructor, decide what is or what mastery looks like and how that translates to a grade. Um, the mastery, depending on sometimes depending on what the outcome is or um, what the assignment is, it's usually set about 75 or 80%. So it's not about a student getting a certain assignment 100% correct. I mean, it certainly can be. It depends. That's your choice. But typically, it's not about it being perfect. It's about being good enough that you're confident in saying, hey, yeah, the student understands this concept, or they can apply this concept, or they know how to do this. And the last key factor is that eventual mastery matters. So students should have multiple attempts to demonstrate mastery, and they should learn from their mistakes rather than be penalized for them. So there should be opportunity to redo some assignments and resubmit them or retry. What that looks like varies greatly. It's obviously going to depend on your load, your types of assignments, um, and how you set the the structure for your outcomes. Um, so there's some outcomes that maybe you're happy for them to try over and over again, and maybe some outcomes that they're only going to have a couple of attempts on, because because even though we want to give them opportunities to redo things, we're also humans who need to grade these things. So it's a matter of, can you set up a system that works for you, um, that allows students this type of flexibility. And I'll just, as a side comment here, is this is the part that my students like the most, the ability that they're not tied to extremely hard deadlines, um, that they can uh, resubmit almost all of the assignments that they submit to me. Um, that is something that they really appreciate because they are bogged down with other classes and jobs and life in general. Um, so that's one of the big selling points, I think, for the students. And here's a list of what I consider pros and cons. The highlight pros for me is I can set pretty high standards for my students. And there's a lot of transparency in terms of what they still need to do to get a certain grade. They get good feedback in terms of what they need to do or what they should practice to improve their grade. Grading is easy, right? They either met the outcome or they didn't. There's no partial points to figure out. Um, I like that it encourages a growth mindset and to be persistent. It's more similar to what they might find in a professional field. And like I said, the failure tolerance, where if they don't do a particular assignment correctly, they have a chance to resubmit it, um, and learn from those mistakes, right? Because that's life, right? Learning from mistakes. Um, the biggest cons for me is the prep work and kind of under figuring out the structure that I'm using. I've keep pretty much every semester I've changed something to make it work better. And initially, students are pretty unfamiliar and they're worried about how the system will work and how their grades are determined. Um, Using the outcomes in Canvas has made that a bit easier because they can check that there. But it takes a few tries for them to think, well, wait a minute, I can redo this and improve my grade. And it's like, yes, you can. And once that happens a couple times, that's when it kind of starts sinking in. But they are initially somewhat nervous because they've never all, I don't think any of my students have ever seen this type of grading before. So this is what my this is what's on my syllabus in terms of how to get letter grades. So I have these best practice outcomes. So these best practice outcomes are things like I will participate, in group discussions is one of them, or I will regularly participate in group discussions. It could be things like I can use claim evidence and reasoning in my explanation. So these are kind of broad scientific best practices type of outcomes. Then there's some core course outcomes, and everyone has to show me that they've mastered those course outcomes to pass the class with at least a C. Then if they want an A or a B, there's some additional outcomes that they have to demonstrate. And then this is just for this class this semester. It looks a little bit different from my other classes. In this class, we're going to do unit interviews, which I'm trying out this semester instead of doing tests. But in other courses, for example, they might have to complete a certain number of journal review articles. So this is known as kind of grade bundling. So it's like a checklist of things that students need to have to get a certain grade. So as long as they can check off everything on that checklist, they get that grade. And for grading the outcomes, I use a 3-scale system. You could use a 3-level or a 4. I use a 3-level. There's a 2-level, a 4-level. You probably don't want to go more than 3 or 4 levels. And so basically, an M is that they've mastered it. They can check it off their list. If they get an R, they either need to redo it or resubmit it or get retested on it. And N is no evidence. So that's something, if they didn't give me enough evidence or they left it blank, that's what I would use that for. And now I'll pass it off to Anthony to talk about his grading system.
Oh yeah, thanks. So yeah, I'll just first say like, when Tony first like kind of invited me to talk about standard-based grading, I felt a little hesitant because I've pretty much just stolen all my work from other people, and that's why I think Gloria was great to like talk about it in more general. And even though I've stolen from like Frank Nikhazy and like Andrew Runquist and like Drew Morrison, like and I'm still at the point where I would say like there's kind of like a partial standard-based grading, because I think you'll see like places where like the entire course grade is based on standards. And I don't think I'm quite there yet, where I still have like kind of like traditional components. And this is like from my syllabus from the fall, which is why we're still doing like, things like Zoom and remote learning. So I still have like these like little components that you would see like at a traditional scale, like, problem sets and labs and an exam. But as you can kind of see from what I did last fall, like the bulk of what I'm doing is again based on like standards as Gloria kind of described it. And maybe a little bit different than what Gloria described. And this is kind of maybe like one, I don't know if it's necessarily one end of the spectrum, but at least my particular implementation. Like my standards, which basically look like the student learning outcomes that you'd see like for like particular topics or concepts, aren't necessarily divided into like categories, like a core concept versus I guess what was the language that used, Gloria, like core concept versus
and best practices.
best practices. Yeah.
Addition,
So yeah, so like all the outcomes, say like in physics 1 and physics 2, are just essentially given like a point value. Now, as you can kind of see from that little snippet from the syllabus, each standard is worth 10 points. It's not to say that I use a 10-point grading scale. Like I don't have like a 10 levels, because that would be too much. Because again, the reason why I thought to adopt standard-based grading was, as Gloria mentioned, just the ease of grading, right? Like I'll freely admit I was a glacially slow assessor, prior to standard-based grading. Like agonize or go every little point. But now, when you only have like three or four levels, it becomes very quick to like recognize whether a student is in that mastery level or if they're still like in the developing level. And over time, I've played with a number of points just so that the letter grade at the end of the semester kind of better reflects what I think is going on. So I use like a 0, 5, like 7, 8, 10 scale type of thing. Um, but but um, but yeah, it's still using very I guess coarse uh, a coarse rubric as opposed to like something pretty granular. Um, and then echoing what Gloria said, like beyond just the ease of grading, really the opportunity for the students to show mastery over time and reassess their work is really the big benefit for me. It is a lot of work, as Gloria mentioned, but I feel like those conversations that I'm having with students that are essentially akin to what Joe was talking about last week, where it's kind of like an oral exam or like a conversation where I'm giving a student a chance to demonstrate that they've maybe increased their understanding for a particular standard. I feel like that is a much like a richer conversation in terms of me being able to like look at a student's work and like kind of almost like uh, talk directly to them about where I see where how and why I see they fit into like a particular level in my rubric. And so yeah, so like my initial assessment, at least back in the before times, was always like a paper-based quiz. That was always how I initially assessed the standard. But a student always had the option to reassess a learning standard if they felt like they wanted to. And so a lot of my thought these days is trying to encourage, well, trying to make sure students are aware that they can reassess and encouraging them to do that, because I felt like it's kind of the typical thing where the first time around doing this, I think the students who probably didn't need to take advantage of this were the ones who were like always like asking for reassessments and wanting to improve from like an 8 to a 10 or a 4 to a 5 or whatever. And so my a lot of my effort these days is trying to like encourage the students who I feel like would probably benefit, at least in terms of like their grade at the end of the semester, if they were to you know go through and take the time and the effort to schedule reassessments for me with me, and maybe show that they've improved their understanding for some of those early standards. And a lot of that is being willing to become like more available, right? Like do them outside of office hours. I think these days I'll probably continue to do them over Zoom, like at odd times, kind of like what Joe was saying last week. Um, but I think, yeah, just making it more equitable and giving these reassessment opportunities for students who I think could benefit from them. Um, yeah, every semester I'm kind of playing with it and maybe moving a little bit further away from this sort of partial implementation and trying to like think about how some of these other most traditional components could sort of fit into the standard-based framework. But I'm not quite there yet, which is why it's still just like a large portion of how I set up my grading, but not the 100%. So yeah, so that's kind of, and I could talk more, and I'm sure Gloria could talk more, but I guess that's kind of my specific implementation of standards-based grading.
If I could just add to what Anthony just said about conversations with students, um, I in the before times after a test, which was kind of the major assessment of the standard, I required students to come and talk to me, and so I set up like an appointment schedule, and those conversations weren't about why did I get this question wrong. Those conversations were about, you need to practice this some more, and you should if you want this grade in this class, you're going to need to retest this and this and this, or I could tell the students, if you retest these things, you could actually go up a letter grade. I've had that happen several times. So it's a very different conversation with students about what they know and what they should practice than before I went to standards-based grading.
So I think that's all we had sort of like prepared, right,
Yeah.
Gloria? I think, yeah. So yeah, I think I don't know. Does anyone like want to know more about like our specific implementation or have questions? Yeah, go ahead,
I,
Michael.
mhm.
Could you elaborate a little more on the retakes or resubmissions for homework? How many times do you allow it? Is it the entire assignment or just the questions that they didn't show mastery? Um, is it different problems and the same type of things for exams? How do you run your exams if you give exams?
Do you want to go ahead, Gloria, or?
I was just going to say, did you want to go first, Anthony?
I'll go first this time. Maybe we could like switch back and forth. So yeah. So the way I've done it is, let's see. I don't give exams. Well, so I do give exams, but and this is the thing that students sort of have to wrap their heads around. They're not really exams. Like they're just sort of like big quizzes in a sense that don't like have its own special place in the gradebook. They're just a longer period of time for me to either assess new standards or reassess old standards like that I'm initiating, because we just have more time to do it, right? Because typically, like what I'm able to do is maybe like 1 or 2 standards a week, like just in the kind of form of like a quick quiz. But sort of exams kind of give me a chance, like a longer time period to like, yeah, incorporate older standards or maybe some more advanced standards. And yeah, students kind of wonder like, well, when is the midterm? How much is it worth? And it's like, well, it's just a big quiz. And you're going to see like 2 or 3 standards as opposed to 1. And they ask, well, can we reassess those standards that appear in the quiz? We're like, yeah, it's just a standard, right? Like it, we reassess it, however you want to. I don't have any like time frame like limitations. I know some people do, but yeah, if someone wants to reassess a standard that they initially took in August, in December, that's up to you, right? Like the only limitation is really my availability, right? Which means that you're not going to be able to reassess every standard because I don't make myself that available. So students have to be somewhat strategic and recognize that, make use of the opportunities you have, because if you wait till May, you're not going to be able to reassess like all 16 standards in a week. Like I'm not going to be like a lot, let that happen because I just can't, devote that much time. But yeah, the reassessments before, I think I just sort of let it say, okay, make these appointments with me and I'll try to accommodate you as much as I can. But as I was sort of alluding to before, what I had was like a lot of the like, B+, A- students making like 50 appointments and like, wanting to like reassess, a standard. And then if they didn't get it, if they didn't get like mastery, having that appointment the next day, like, as a kind of fallback. So I did have to sort of limit it just to make sure that like the opportunity was at least theoretically available to all, right? So that like not 1 or 2 students was like taking up all like the sort of like time slots. So I sort of limited to like, which is completely arbitrary on my end that I think about it, like basically, like a couple times a week, which I think with my class sizes should give every student at least the opportunity to reassess a number of times, and sometimes even more, because like I said, some students just feel like whatever, for whatever reason, I'm sure they've got a lot going on, but they're not going to just reassess, whether it's just not realizing that opportunity is available to them or just not having the time because they say like, okay, I'm happy with the grade I got at my test, I'm satisfied with that, and I can't spare the additional time it's going to take to make an appointment. Sorry, that was a lot. Did that kind of answer your question, at least on my end, Michael?
Yeah, and for me, what I have are a lot of what I call low stakes assignments. And so under that category could be things like, labs and problem sets and in-class assignments when we're, in the before times and things like that. So some of those assignments, um, I'm thinking like this semester, I have a lab assignment, which in the before times was an actual lab where students, it's the standard one, right? The very first one where they play with the scotch tape and the rods and all that kind of stuff. And I have this other assignment where they're given scenarios. So, this charged rod is brought near this thing and what happens, or it's brought near an electroscope. So a series of questions. And so if students, like I use that to determine whether they've mastered the outcome related to using the charge model, right? And then others, some of my outcomes are what I would not categorize, but I think of them as skills. Like, can they do this thing, right? Can I calculate the electric field due to a point charge? Well, if they can do that in a homework or in an in-class assignment, that's fine. I don't need to give a big test with a point charge question on there. I can give them more interesting questions on the test when we had tests. And so because they have multiple opportunities to submit those, they can keep practicing that and doing that until they get those correct. And then some of the broader, uh, broader outcomes that I have, where it's kind of a synthesis of a lot of skills. The example I always give for that is predict, analyze, or explain the behavior of a thermodynamic device, right? Because they have to use a PV diagram and apply the first law and calculate efficiencies and or coefficients. There's a lot of things that I think they need to be able to do in order to show that they've mastered. So the low stakes assignments give them practice so that hopefully they're prepared for when they had the test and they knew that that was coming. I was going to ask them, I was going to tell them, here's a PV diagram for a heat engine or a refrigerator. What can you tell me about it? So the either the low stakes assignments, I serve to measure the mastery if it's a relatively simple or straightforward outcome, or I use it to prepare them for a major outcome. And then in the before times, for the tests, there would be like a reassessment period for a few weeks after the test. And so I would have these blocks of time where they could come in to do their retesting. And if they didn't do so well on that, they could come in the next time that we had those retesting blocks to redo it. So it was just, I set aside a day, different blocks of time throughout the day, and they would sign up to come at a certain time. Now, this semester, following kind of Jill's idea, I'm doing interviews this semester, but only for students who want an A or B in the class. Because I feel that students, if they're doing all of the assignments that I require for to get at least a C in the class, that's good enough for me, right? It means that they can do kind of all the basic things of the class. An A or B student, I'm expecting kind of deeper thinking, deeper applications of the concepts. And so that's something that I feel is easier to judge if I'm talking to them rather than some online test that now I have to become the online police for, and that doesn't help anybody. So that's why I'm only doing those interviews for whoever wants an. So I'm not limiting it. I'm saying if you want an A or B in the class, you have to sign up for these interviews. But
I really like that.
Yeah,
I really like that.
So we'll see how that goes. I think the first set of interviews are next week. So and then those interviews, And I had to set up rules, minor rules for retesting. I feel like I'm talking a lot, but um, not so much how many they can redo, but I do put a limit in terms of the calendar because um, not so much for the class I teach in the fall, but for I'm teaching second semester physics now, right? And so if you don't know what an electric field is now, you're going to be in trouble in 2 weeks when we do the next thing. So they can't leave it to the end of the semester. So I do give them kind of signposts, like everything related to, I break everything up into units. So I'm like, everything in this unit you need to retest by this date, or else you'll be struggling the rest of the semester. Um, and for some things, like for example, for like the interviews, if they need to redo an interview, I require them to put together, basically it's a reflection piece about what they studied, what they practiced, what problems they, what extra problems they did. So I have a set of guidelines for them to show me that they've actually done something to improve and it's worth my time and their time to do another interview. Um, and like I haven't had any interviews yet, but I did use that when I would do tests and if they needed a second reassessment, I had the same type of thing where basically they had to earn a ticket to reassess something a second time. So the first time's a freebie, the second time, I don't want you to waste anybody's time.
Can I jump in here?
Mhm.
I just started after taking Gloria's workshop at the meeting and the AAPT meeting in January. So I'm totally new to the mastery-based grading thing, and I will say that there was a lot at the beginning to set up. But in terms of answering Michael's question about redos, everything is remote, so I have been having students submit handwritten work. So there are a couple of questions they have to submit each week for assessment, and then I have a 3-point grading scale, I guess, mastered, almost, or not yet. If they're not yet, they have to reassess, and I've got some more questions that are different, but on the same concepts. If they're almost, it's usually a minor error or they haven't been as clear as I'd like them to be about a concept. So then I just have them submit a correction or come see me in office hours, and then they'll just answer the question or send me an email if it's a quick answer. So it's actually been pretty fast to redo those. So anyways, it's another perspective, another take on how to do these things.
Thank you. And if I could, not for now, but because I don't want to take too much of everybody else's time, but before we end, any advice for somebody who's planning on implementing standard-based or specification grading in the fall? Me. Any advice on how to maybe ease into it instead of a full implementation? I would really appreciate that.
Don't be afraid. It's the scariest thing I've ever done. And I've done some scary stuff. And this was probably the scariest.
And don't be afraid to ask those of us who've done it for help and advice. I got a lot of help and advice from math folks who do this a lot because that's the community I found online. And just seeing what they did, I'm like, okay, that could work for me. Oh, that won't work for me because of the nature of the courses were different. And you also, I think the core idea is, what do you want your students to do at the end of the semester? To be able to, what do you want your students to look like at the end of the semester, right? What have they learned? What can they do? And that was the guiding question for me. And then whenever I looked at my old assignment, I'm like, well, why am I having them do this assignment? Why are they doing 20 problems when 10 of them are so similar? So it made me really rethink my assignments and what I asked students to do. And so it was all purposeful. It had to be guided by the outcome. So if it didn't help them get to that outcome, which I feel is important, then why are they doing that? So that that would be my advice, to uh, think about your outcomes first and design your assignments around those outcomes.
Almost
all
done
been-
with my first class.
We've all been conditioned that teaching, learning, assessment, testing, examination, all had to look a certain way. And so a big realization for me was, it doesn't have to look a certain way. And as professionals, we can choose how it looks in our individual situations. That was a very liberating thought for me. And it took me quite literally years, sorry, Michael, but it took me years to get to the point to where I wasn't too afraid to try some really radical in terms of antiquated administrative practices and so forth things. So it's okay to confront those preconceived notions of how something is supposed to look, because the stuff I'm doing now looks nothing like the stuff I was doing 15 years ago. Nothing.
And it could be small changes as well. Like one of the first changes I did was in my third semester class is um, waves, optics, and modern physics. So it's very, the labs lent themselves to more investigative type of labs. And so instead of having students write a lab report every week, I'm like, well, no, my goal is for them to be able to write good lab reports, right? To know how to write a method section and a good introduction and an abstract. So I redesigned it so that for the first several labs, the focus was only on one part of the lab report, so that they could work on doing that correctly and then building on that. And so that then changed how I addressed that in terms of the outcomes, right? So one mistake I think is to have too many outcomes in the beginning, because you think, oh, my students need to be able to do this and this and this. And so I went from a student should be able to write an abstract and an introduction or whatever, to the broader, they can write a lab report, right? And how that's shown is a separate question, but that is the real outcome that I wanted, right? And that doesn't mean writing 5 lab reports by the end of the semester. It means being able to write a good one by the end of the semester.
Thank you.
And Michael, I'll just quickly say, like, I had the kind of good fortune to, like, so the first semester I was doing this, my colleague in chemistry, I think we both went to like Andrew Morrison's talk at Joliet Junior College about standard-based grading. So we decided to kind of do it at the same time. And, we were always kind of like talking and comparing notes about how things were going. And it's kind of interesting to see, like, my colleague in chemistry, like, he likes like these really granular, like 100 points, like partial credit ways of grading. I was like, I'm never doing that. Like that's what I'm trying to get away from. But he was completely comfortable with that, and he decided that he was going to do it that way, and really focus on, like, I'm going to give my students the opportunity to reassess. And like he did his reassessments, like kind of like paper and pen quizzes, like 5 students doing it all at the same time in the classroom. And I did it like, okay, we're going to have this one-on-one conversation. So we just kind of talked about how things were going, and like just kind of compared notes. And so, like, there's really no, just like anything, there's no really right answer. It's just kind of just being open to kind of trying it this different way. And I guess the other thing is, I don't know if you like have like a standard like a canned, like end of semester like evaluation form. Like, we don't, so we can kind of design whatever we want. And ever since the first semester, I've always like, I've always asked a question like, how do you feel about standards-based grading? What's your take on like a standard-based grading versus like a traditional, traditional grading scheme? And I've always like used like the open-ended responses from the previous class to try to sell students in the next class. I mean, not to say that all the feedback is glowing, but I would say the majority is, and then you have the student perspective of why they maybe appreciated, at least appreciated the opportunity to. I mean, they always talk about the reassessment part and having like kind of clear standards for them to base this on. I mean, some students don't like the work, and some students don't like, that they feel like they have to do all these reassessments, even though they don't really have to. But yeah, I think for the most part, at least the feedback I've gotten has been pretty positive. So I try to use that to sell, the next, I guess, next generation of students.
So
Thank you.
I started with the idea of standards-based grading with just labs. So that was kind of my getting my feet wet thing. And that was because I didn't do lab reports. Students always just did lab notebooks. And so there were sort of criteria to get, a C or a B or an A on their lab report. And I realized that was just standards-based grading. I just hadn't used the terminology before. So
I'm feeling the same way, because the way I grade my assignments now is based on a 4-tier system. You everything is correct, minor errors, major errors, no attempt. And I'm thinking that might qualify as a good beginning to expand, not just on assignments, but maybe on quizzes, exams, lab reports, and the such. That way, and I know Joe doesn't use rubrics, but I use a rubric for that, just so that it's at least consistent in the way I view my grading of their work. The hardest part for me, and I think this might be just my ignorance, is coming up with the standards. What is enough, what's not enough, and how many of them is enough, how many is not enough. Do I want to make my students cry by listing all of them? And here's 2 pages of standards you have to demonstrate mastery by the end of the semester. That's the struggle, right?
Yeah, I don't know if Anthony wanted to jump in there, but that's still a struggle for me. Like I tweak them every semester when I realize, oh wait, no, that's not what I really wanted, or that didn't seem to work, or yeah, you know what, I never have time to do that in any semester that I've tried to do that, so I chuck it. We have a small repository that you're welcome to kind of look at and steal from. I put the link in the chat.
I've been there many a times.
On your course, right? Is it a 5-unit course? Is it a 4-unit course? Who are your students? That's one of the 2 biggest struggles for me. The other one is deciding how do I translate that to a letter grade? Those were my 2 big questions.
Yeah, I'll say I cheated in the sense and just like kind of went through like the instructor guide of our textbook, and just kind of like it's night. So I think they have like every chapter has like a couple of like student learning outcomes in their parlance. And I looked at which ones I think are really important. And I reworded them a little bit. But yeah, I use that as my basis because yeah, I don't consider myself very like articulate in many ways. So it's like I need something to kind of as a template, and I started there. And then I think like I was all as Gloria mentioned, every semester I'm kind of looking for like a mismatch from what am I actually assessing versus what is the standard read. Like I felt like okay, like when it comes to like say like energy conservation, like this standard reads one way, but what I'm really looking for in these assessments, I'm looking for maybe something else. So it's kind of a matter of like trying to make the standard that the student reads and is supposed to kind of be following match what I'm like trying to assess. And I think originally there's some standards, there was a pretty good match. Others, not so much, because I was like maybe going off, a learning outcome in their parlance that maybe didn't, didn't know what I was trying to do, in that time. But yeah, there's a lot of stealing from other places and just adapting to, to my context.
Yeah, and I would say if you're using, like, if you're someone who uses like model-based physics, like the constant velocity particle model or whatever, you can use that to frame your outcomes as well. So if you're already using that type of framework, use that to build your outcomes. Or team-based learning, or whatever system. We have a million systems, right? Whichever one you're using, use that to help build out your outcomes.
Thank you.
How do you
More,
separate
more work
out
ahead.
how do you separate out learning when, like, my class has a lot of group work in it? Like, I have exams that are or not exams, quizzes that are group based. I have a lot of group based in class work. How do you separate out which work in a group assignment goes with which student when assessing their like, does that work not, like, I'm we're trying to assess whether a student themselves as an individual has achieved mastery, right? But if a lot of the in-class work is group-based, like, how are you sussing out who in the group is contributing what?
So I guess I'll quickly say, I think that's part of the reason why, like, I'm still kind of like in this partial standards-based grading implementation. Because to be honest, before I did standards-based grading, one of my favorite things to do was group exams, right? Because I felt like that was like really when like everyone was engaged, right? People were talking, and I haven't figured out a way of really doing, um, I can still do it, of course, but like fitting that into the standards-based framework that I've set out, because yeah, like you said, every standard is kind of done at an individual level. And so I think I could still like incorporate group exams, although I haven't yet tried to do that, and make it kind of like a separate component in some way, that doesn't fall into the standard-based framework. But I guess in terms of like the formative assessment, that they're just doing not for a grade, but just, just to kind of, improve their understanding. Yeah, there's still a lot of group work, right? As much as we can during remotely. It just doesn't get incorporated into like a standards-based framework on my end, because it's all there just in service of, hopefully hoping you get to the point where you feel like when you're going to be asked to do this at an individual level, you'll have mastered that standard because of the group dynamics that happened prior to that. I guess that's that. So I don't know if that's a satisfactory answer, but that's how I like look at it.
Yeah, and for me, when we were in class and had a flip class, a lot of student group work, that really only went towards the one standard I have about working in groups. So as I walked around the class, making sure everybody was contributing to the group, and like Anthony said, it was to prepare them for that quote unquote big assessment, the test or the quiz or whatever that would be individual. This semester online, I'm having students do group discussions. So a group of 4 students, I give them 4 problems. They each do one of them, and they have to do a voice thread presentation on it. They can help each other with their problems. They have to give each other feedback on their solutions. So there's that individual grade component to it. But it's still is not used for grading the outcome, but they can use that preparation. In this case, I'm having students do portfolios where they kind of put together all evidence that they've mastered outcomes, so they can use those what they put together for that presentation to put into their portfolio, and then they can use that problem that I give them in the group assignment is something that can come up when I do their interview. So I could tell them, so you did this question for the group assignment. Well, what if this happened? Or what if this changes? How would that change your answer? Right? So there's always an individual aspect, like the group stuff is to help them get to the point where they can do stuff on their own.
And I think I played around one semester with kind of like a modified group exam where like the for like what I call like an advanced standard that required like a lot of synthesis of like different topics, where um like I gave the groups like how did I do this? I think I gave the groups a question, like a single question for this advanced standard that didn't have any like numbers, just like the concept that they were going to tackle. And then they were supposed to discuss it in groups and sort of strategize how they're going to approach the problem. And then I gave them individually like the actual like problem with a lot more detail, a lot more information, and they had to kind of like, approach it on their own, with the knowledge that they hopefully gained in discussion with the group. So I guess that's potentially, if I go back to that, that could be like one way where you're not necessarily assessing the group dynamic, you're still assessing the students as individuals, but hopefully they've benefited from the chance to kind of at least plan their approach to the problem in groups. I don't know if that's a good idea or not, but that's what I came up.
I had a quick question for you on the pushback. I don't know if you can remember any student pushback or faculty colleagues pushback. Have you encountered that at all? You mentioned a little bit, but
The only thing that I've really encountered is some students still come to me and say, so what's my grade? And my general response to that is, well, that concept doesn't exist in this course. So here's the question you need to ask. What do I need to reassess on? That's the question you need to ask. And so it's very tough to get them, it's very tough to break them from talking about grades, because that's how we've all been conditioned. And so we can have this discussion, and then at the end of the discussion, the student will look at me and say, okay, I understand this, but what's my grade? And I'm like, bye-bye, we're done. Come back tomorrow and I'll try to explain this again. And so what I do is I give them the algorithm that I use to convert their number of proficiencies, masteries, however you say it, into a number, which then maps into the almighty important letter grade. And it's surprising how many of them ignore that information when it's what they claim they want, that it's very important to them. But I give them the algorithm and I say, okay, so here's what you can do. You can calculate what I call a meaningless interim grade. And they can sit down and they can do that and say, oh, I'm getting a C. I thought I was flunking. That's almost a word for word quote every time. I thought I was doing so much worse than that. I'm like, well, now you see why I gave up this this points-based grading system. Now you see that you are actually kind of learning something and that you don't need to worry about failing, and you need to focus on learning again, because I promise if you demonstrate the learning, you're going to pass the class. Okay, so don't worry about that. And I try to frame it as not negotiating a grade, because I don't think that's what we're doing, but just getting them to not ask the question, so what is my grade? And getting them to reframe that as, what do I need to work on? That's been really the only student pushback that I've gotten.
Yeah, and I often turn that back on them to say, well, what grade do you want in this class? Well, if you want that grade, this is what you still need to do. In the past, I've given them like a checklist, like with the standards and required, like the required assignments, like the online problem sets. So, and that worked okay. I'm not sure if that was worth the effort for me to put that together, but the only pushback I've gotten was just initially a couple students, just because it's so unfamiliar. I think, like Joe said in the chat, but I think once they see that I think they're so trained, as we all were, that test grade is the most important thing in the universe, and so when they realize that they don't have to worry about that, and B, they know exactly, if I'm going to give a test, they know exactly the types of questions I'm going to ask, because I just told you I expect you to calculate this, or I expect you to apply this. So there's no guessing in terms of, I don't want to say, I don't give them the exact problems I'm going to give them, but I give them I don't just tell them this test is on Coulomb's law, right? They're they have the outcomes. So I'm gonna ask them something related to those outcomes, and they've been in all the assignments that we've done so far have been prepping them for the types of things I might be asking them. So once they realize that there's really what I consider no surprises, then students feel a lot more comfortable with the system.
And I'll be really quick since I know there's a hand up, but yeah, I would say like the only pushback I've gotten was like, students who, yeah, as Gloria mentioned, are so conditioned to like, just really putting in the work for the exams. Like they're like, why are we having quizzes like every week, right? Like, why do I have to like keep up with all this, and I know it's a lot, right? Like there's no denying it, but like they want to be able to, or I think they want to be able to just sort of like really say, okay, these are the 2 dates on the calendar that I really need to focus on, and they're not necessarily prepared to like be really, or I'm forcing them to be constantly engaged, with the class on a very regular basis. But I would say on the flip side, what transitioning to standards-based grading, I think I have students who maybe in a past, in a previous semester would like, kind of come to me and like maybe complain about their grade, or, say like, why did I get this? I would say like even like the students who, admittedly they could have done better, like maybe they got a C in the grade. They recognize that, where, why they got the grade. It's like, oh, if I had taken advantage of reassessing these learning standards early on, I think I could have done better in the course. Or, if I had, that if I had been able to like, maybe go back and do this reassessment and show that I understand, yeah, again, Coulomb's law better. I think that could have made a big difference. And it's like, yeah, it's kind of a taking ownership of their grade.
I have a question about if a student wants to get an A or a B, you would require that student to set up an interview. And have you had a student who says, I'm not comfortable with the interview, but I would like to get the grade, and that kind of pushback? Have you had that? That's my first question. Second one is, I know you talked about lab report. I tend to grade individual lab reports that range anywhere between 8 to 15 pages. So I know you mentioned about focusing on one of the methods and then gradually developing a final polished lab report. So can you elaborate on that one? Does that mean that each student does not write a lab report for each lab? Or how? I just would like you to elaborate just for my to work on my own. I'm working on a rubric, but I think I would like to get some more elaboration.
I haven't done the interviews yet, so that might be a better question for Joe. But I haven't had any students ask me to do something other than the interviews. So, and a lot of them, I think the response was, wait, there's no tests, just these one-on-one conversations, interviews. Like, yeah, that's all there is. And that seemed to have a good response. So we'll see. As for the lab reports, you're correct. They didn't have to write a full lab report for every lab. So I followed a system that they use at North Carolina State University, where the order of a lab report is not the order that you should write it in, right? So that the order you should write it in is the order that I use. So for that first experiment, or the first two experiments are about the method section and like the data section. So they get practice in writing a good method section and good practice in terms of organizing and analyzing their data. And then I kind of go on kind of from there, kind of in the order that you should write it in. So each lab or two, depending on which lab it is, adds a new section that they write. So the first lab is just the methods section. The next lab is methods and data. Then we do another methods and data. And then the next one would be methods, data, and experiment discussion. And so we do a couple labs that just do those three sections, and kind of build like that.
I guess I'll just quickly say, like, I think since I've had, I've done the interviews, before they were like one-on-one in my office. Now they're on Zoom. I think the only times it was basically like students who are like, they just felt really anxious having me kind of like sit there and kind of like, looking over their shoulder as they were working. And, in person, I'd say, okay, I'll turn around, so it's not like I'm hovering. And they seem to like that. And I think one time on, like, when I was teaching in the fall, like having my camera on, like in Zoom, like they didn't have to have their camera on, but I think the fact that my camera was on and I was like present on their computer screen as we were talking, that kind of made them anxious. So I was like, okay, fine, I'll just turn off my camera and just I can hear you. So yeah, I don't usually the pushback I've gotten during the interviews are just maybe just having me as a presence when maybe, as opposed to like them, taking a test in their chair while I'm like at the front of the classroom or something. But yeah, other than those sort of like, I don't know if it's a personal space issue or just like an anxiety issue. Yeah, I haven't had too many pushbacks on the interviews, because again, if in my case, if they feel strongly about it, then I tell them that you never have to schedule an interview as long as you do well in that initial assessment. And so if you do well in the initial assessment and get like mastery in that time, then you never have to darken my door.
I really like this idea of making the interviews another level. I think I'm going to try that next year, Gloria. I think you've gotten in my head a little bit there. I really, really like that idea. And if I may just speak to the pushback, I can honestly say that I have not experienced any pushback for the interviews. The students, they'll come in thinking it's nervous and that it's going to be like a dissertation defense or like a master's comp or something. They're like, oh God, oh God. And at the end, they're going, that's all it was? You just asked me some questions and I showed you my work. And now you say, I did it, I passed. Yes, what the hell were you expecting? And I try to frame it as I want it to be a discussion with them in charge. I want them to show me what they can learn, or what they have learned, rather. And if you make a mistake, fine, identify it and correct it. That counts as learning, in my opinion. I learned that from Sarah Formica at University of North Georgia, or excuse me, North Georgia University. So yeah, I find that once they see that it's not as stressful as they thought it was going to be, as they're conditioned to think something like that is going to be, I think they actually love it. And I actually now have students showing up early for their interviews. Can we start now? I'm like, no, I'm still in an office hour. I got to sit here for 10 more minutes. But it's just a totally different, you can see the change in their comfort level with this as it becomes the new norm.
Yeah, I think the name interview, like I didn't want to call it oral test because that's scary, so I went with interview, thinking that I could frame it in this is like a performance interview with your boss or performance review with your boss. And I was trying to find the good phrase. I just went with interview because I ran out of time and had to write up my syllabus. But I keep trying to frame it to the students as it's just the two of us having a conversation. And now that I'm using this portfolio idea, I think I'm going to call it a portfolio review. So they have all this evidence that they're going to present to me, and we go over some of it, and then I can ask all the what if questions I want based on that. And I think that's even less scary.
yeah, the words we use and the psychological framing is very important. If you call it an exam, they're going to freeze.
So how long has it been, or how long did it take you to get here?
I've been doing mastery grading for probably 4 or 5 years now, something like in some form. But like Michael said earlier, I was already kind of doing it in my head, right? Like for lab reports, I was sort of already doing that in my head, and even for exams, I would already be kind of sorting like, oh yeah, this is an A grade problem, this is a B grade solution, you know. Um, so yeah, probably about that long.
Yeah,
Yeah, same with me as well.
I think it's a great idea. I would probably takes time to set it up, but I like your approach. I think it's great. Starting from the outcome and then going back and finding out. I think that's a great approach.
Tony and
Thank
Tom,
you.
do we have time to take Jason's question? Or
Yeah, we should. Jason has been waiting.
I'm hanging out. Go.
I was just curious, is there more or less students who question the grading with the mastery approach? Just because there's more riding on it. It's like, okay, really? You're saying I didn't master it? Like now I have to go through and I have to go do an extra assignment and then come back and do another interview. Or is it less because they have the chance to reassess?
Yeah, for me, I would say it's generally less, especially as the semester goes on. It's kind of like a word of mouth type of thing, right? Where, first few weeks, people are just like wrapping their head around like what exactly I'm doing, but then, as students like realize that they could reassess, especially as it doesn't take long in physics for like a hard standard to come up, and for students to kind of like realize, oh, I really wish I could have do that over again, and then as students realize that they can, kind of word sort of spreads, right? We have small classes, so I think people realize that they could kind of take advantage of the opportunity to reassess if they would like. So for me, I think by the end of the semester, there's less questions about the grade. I mean, they're definitely at the beginning, which is why I think like, my usual spiel that like I used to do in terms of like reading the syllabus, right? I mean, I don't know I don't know if that was ever very useful, but like these days, I think it's more of a conversation about like standards-based grading, because that's like the new thing for everyone, like in terms of just sort of going through and saying, okay, well, we'll talk about this a little bit, but it won't make sense until we actually have our first standard. So, maybe we'll hold off on this discussion and we'll revisit it when it's time to do this initial reassessment. But yeah, I'm still at the point where I find myself sort of like walking them through this process, that usual first day conversation. And there's still always questions. That's been my experience.
Yeah, and I think the grade levels, or grading levels, in my case, mastered, the MRN, let me just phrase it that way, they immediately kind of know that if they got an R, students are usually not surprised when they get an R or an N, because they know what they know and what they don't know. So if it's an R, it's usually a small mistake. And for something like an M, a small calculation mistake or a small sign mistake is not a big deal, right? Like I said, it doesn't have to be perfect to be mastered. So if they got an R, that means that there's something that they're missing, and they know that they're missing that usually, right? The same way a student who maybe gets a C on a test is not surprised, or a D, they're not surprised, right? So and I try to reserve ends if they really leave it blank, or if they really, really, really don't know what's going on. So some are pleasantly surprised they got an M because they felt they made all these little mistakes, which are small trivial things that I don't care about. I might make a note, hey, you made some minor calculation mistakes, be a little more careful next time. But the R's encourage them to come and get more detailed feedback if I didn't give them detailed feedback at that moment.
Thank you. This has
And
been
I'll
a
just
really helpful discussion.
and I'll just quickly say, like, I think, students are sort of surprised, like that, I'm not really, I don't care about the final number. And you're right, in the end, I'm looking for your process. So they get surprised, like, well, I got this part wrong. What's my final like mastery level going to be? And they realize, well, you did a lot right. So you're probably going to get maybe one mastery level than you thought you were. And kind of like what Chris was saying, I have like what's called like the 8+, right? Where, you just as she described it, if you made some kind of minor mathematical error or something that's like pretty minor in my regard, you just have to like correct it in an email or a quick conversation. I'm not going to force you to like come and talk to me to try to bring up your grade, because I think you've done enough and you just needed to kind of do this one little thing to kind of get to what we call like mastery.
Yeah,
and that helps students like cope with that.
Yeah, and I will add that a small calculation mistake that leads to an unreasonable answer can convert an M to an R, right? Because they should be reflecting on their answer to make sure that it makes sense. I don't want to say minor calculation mistakes aren't a big deal. They can be a big deal if they recognize that it was a big deal. And I've told students that if you're working on something and you get something that doesn't make sense and you can't figure out what you did wrong, it's more important for me for you to make a note that say, I know this can't be right because of this, but I can't figure out what I did wrong. That is way more valuable than just submitting whatever they have. That tells me a lot more about where they are.
Yeah, I'm on that same page with I have found in this conversation that I'm about a third of the way to this mastery-based grading scheme anyway. So I will be not afraid, Joe, and take the plunge. But I try to tell that same thing to students. I don't really care what the answer is. I care how you got there, and I care that you can communicate it to me effectively. And that really gets through to them. And especially when when I'm showing them something, I do a lot of basically once every other class meeting or so, I said, I'm just going to work this out and show you how I do this to try and get them to imitate me. It's worked. But I'll say, yeah, see my solution? This is a low B. Why is that? And then they say, you didn't write that down. You just said that you did this, but you didn't write it on the page. So I don't know that you did that when I read that. And I train them really quickly to recognize those shortcomings and solutions. And they say, you skipped like 15 math steps. We have no clue what went on there. And it really gets through really quick when I deliberately make the mistakes and have them point them out.
I co-authored the instructor solutions for Matter Interactions with Aaron Titus, and I have found so many mistakes in our solution. Because students are like, oops, you didn't state the system here. No PR for you, Joe. I'm like, all right, you got me.
So I was gonna ask one final question, if at all.
Yeah, I was just responding in chat. I think
yes.
I know there's another hand up and you have one question, Tony. So I've got time, but
Yeah. So I was gonna think for us who have large classes. I mean, I wasn't in that situation a year ago, so
Yeah.
but I have like 40 students or sometimes 48. How do you scale that? I mean, 2 sections of that or something like. How do you scale it based on? I really don't know what your the numbers you're dealing with, but I feel like if there are a lot of students, it can be hard in terms of timing.
Yeah, for me, like the interviews would always be the hard thing, right? Or the oral reassessments, or whatever you want to call them. Um, and I think that's why, like, again, going back to like Andrew Morrison at Juliet, like I don't know what he does now with the pandemic, but before, I think he supplements, and I started to do this right before COVID hit, supplements a lot of the oral reassessments with like students like taking reassessments in the college testing center. So you could kind of scale that by offloading the sort of proctoring of those written quizzes to the testing center. And I did that. Like I started to do that just for students who wanted like an alternative way to assess from just like an interview. So kind of, yeah, letting them bear the load of how to navigate reassessments from like half of a 40 or 50 person class.
Yeah, when we were in person, I think I mentioned this, I would have big time blocks on a couple different days, and students would just sign up to come to one of those time blocks. Um, and so I could do a bunch of students at once in the, because that was in an empty classroom, so I could seat as many students as I needed to. So that was nice.
I'm the first to admit that the way I do it isn't going to scale if you've got 300 students in your class. It's not going to work. And to me, I think that says more about the model of higher ed. I think that's telling on the system more so than anything else, because I think if your system doesn't allow for genuine assessment and evaluation, I think there's something wrong with the system. Maybe we need a new system. That's a different can of worms. But I traded one logistical nightmare for another. I used to create multiple versions of the same questions. I hate doing that, even though it can be automated. So I gave up that logistical nightmare for the logistical nightmare of scheduling interviews. So and it's funny, I was thinking about this very question over lunch today. I think it comes down to which logistical nightmare are you willing to endure? Because it seems to me there's always going to be one. So choose the one that you think you can deal with the best and go with that one.
So I have one maybe simple question. So the grade I saw on your presentation is A, B, C. So does that mean that there is no room for B plus, A minus, C plus? Is it?
My college doesn't have plus and minus grades, so
Oh,
that
okay.
actually saves me because it makes it a lot easier for me to figure out what I want. But that's just because of where I work.
Thank you.
Yeah, same here, just as I put in the chat.
Yeah, I've run across that. My first job out of grad school was at RIT in Rochester, and at the time they didn't do pluses and minuses. I think they have since changed because students complained about it. But I told students it's like the different, if we call them red and blue, you also have light red and dark red and light blue and dark blue. It's the same thing. Don't worry about plus and minus.
Yeah, we have plus and minuses, so it is.
Yeah, I was gonna say, if you need to worry about plus and minus, I know some of the math folks that I talk to, what they've done is, for example, if they have a cumulative final, they'll use that to determine plus or minus, or they'll have some assignment at the end of the semester to determine whether it's plus or minus, or if they completed, like if they had practice problems. So if they said, if you complete this many practice problems, you get bumped up to a plus grade. So if the students do some extra work, they get that plus, or if they don't meet some minimum, then they get the minus. So you can address that in the system however makes sense to you.
Thank you.
I am now at a place where there is a plus minus system and there wasn't before. So I've been struggling with this as well. And what I ended up doing, since I needed to have everything on the syllabus, is that if I have these outcomes that have multiple parts, I guess, like an A, B, C, D. And so a minus would be that you didn't quite get all the parts of one of them, and a plus is like, let's say you do something really amazing on a lab that could bump you up to a plus. So that's kind of how I ended up dealing with it. But yeah, it starts to get harder to have these gradients.
Thank you.
I guess thanks, Tony, for inviting us to kind of talk about this.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming and sharing with us, and even for Chris and Joe who've done standard-based grading, mastery grading. Thank you for your contributions. I hope we can do this again soon.
Thank you all for coming.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we will be continuing with these. I think there's already one scheduled for early April, but my brain betrays me, so I couldn't
Yes,
tell you for sure.
Joe's doing a LaTeX workshop.
Oh yeah, yes. I'm
Yeah.
excited about that one.
Thank you all.
I'm just glad to see some of this innovative stuff spread around, because it can be bad when you think you're the only one doing something like this and you're thinking, okay, how much damage am I really doing here?
Yeah.
Am I really screwing them over?
What,
I'm not. I don't think so. I don't think so.
what really helped me, Joe, is after meeting Dwayne, I was like, okay, I'm not that radical or crazy or put my students through that. I can't
The
be
not Dwayne test. I like that one.
yeah. I can't be doing that much damage.
And also the realization that like no matter really what we do, it can't be like really that much worse than like a traditional like just
Right.
So
and a lot of it is realizing that the traditional approach, we've all been conditioned to use it because it was what was done to us, and maybe we were the ones who were damaged. And maybe we're the ones seeing the light here, and maybe we're the ones saying, wow, we can do better. And I'm just really glad to see the two-year college community doing this. That's helped me psychologically, because if I'm screwing them over, that means we all kind of are, right?
Right.
well, I probably should have said that at the beginning, but yeah, I'm recording this. I think I'm supposed to tell it like for say that at the beginning, for legal reasons. But I guess Tom, should I share the recording with you? Is that
send me a link and I can get it on the TYC page and
gotcha.
and everything, and maybe even link it into our YouTube channel and stuff. So
my students are watching these videos on YouTube.
Awesome.
So that's very cool. That's very cool.
Awesome.
Yeah, it's we've received some sort of minor pats on the back kind of accolades from the APT leadership. They are taking us as a model for how to do this stuff. And those of you that, if you've received one of those, do you want to be an ambassador in the for the AAPT communities website thing? This is AAPT sort of trying to have their own formalized system for doing things like we've done through our Slack channel, and we don't have to give anything up, but it's sort of another avenue, and it's supposed to also help sort of committee organization and other things that for functionality in AAPT, organizing sessions and things, so you don't take up all of your meeting time at meetings doing things like what's the name of this session going to be. That can maybe happen a lot more asynchronously.
Even inside AAPT, there's a lot of inertia.
But they've arrived at something that I think probably through the realization of, look how good things are going over there with the TYC folks. We need this. And I think there's a similar initiative that's happened with American Physical Society and some other professional societies that they're writing in on. But if you receive one of those invitations, I would encourage you to take part. And I figure I agreed to do it too. It's at the very least I can tell them how bad it is and how they might fix it. And at best we'll have something that's really a valuable tool.
I thought that was sent to everybody.
They said they were selecting. I got something about it like 3 weeks ago from one of the people leading the effort, and then they said they wanted people from the committee of two-year colleges, and then they said, and we're going to select some other people. I think they are selecting two-year college folks because we've proven to be active and engaged with these kinds of things, and therefore they want us to help them promote / test it out.
I'm just posting up the summary on Slack.
Awesome.
Nice.
Those summaries are good, by the way, Chris.
Is the chat also shared? Because there were some good questions in there, and I didn't know if that was also shared.
I don't know. I guess we just text. We can get it shared somehow. I'm sure.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if the chat is not captured on the video, is it? I
It
don't think
is.
so.
Or
Is it?
I think
It's captured with the video.
yeah.
Right, but you don't see it viewing the video.
But it doesn't integrate it, I don't think,
Okay.
but it shouldn't be hard to do.
I think in my case, like it's not ready like when the video is like first available, but like it takes a few hours for the chat to well actually no, I'm thinking of the transcript. Never mind. Yeah.
Right. Because when the video saves locally, I get a text dump of the chat. So maybe
Yeah.
we can start posting the text file
Yeah.
things to chat. I don't know if YouTube allows for us attachments like that. Or maybe we could send that on the listserv or stick it on Slack.
We could stick it. Maybe we should. I think we should probably do some combination of put it on Slack, send it to the listserv, and stick it on the TYC website, which I can do.
Okay. Well,
So.
I'm not sure it's that interesting, but might want to.
I'm all in favor of the fire hose of options.
I think everybody should see the not Dwayne test. I think that's
well, I just saved the chat. I just saved the chat now, so I'll send you the text file that was generated.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks. Thanks for doing this. It was a really productive discussion. I enjoyed it.
Yes, you both affected me profoundly today, and I appreciate that. I think I'm going to steal some of your ideas.
Kudos to Gloria for giving me the courage to try it. New school, new group of students. I'll just dive right into a new type of assessing.
We're going to change the world.
And Gloria, do you want to?
Don't be afraid. You got to do it.
Before we go, have you already plugged the mastery grading workshop, or are you full?
We are not full. I did post it in the Slack channel, but
okay.
The Mastery Grade Conference is this June, early June. Yeah. And there are sessions for if you're a beginner and have never done this before, and there are going to be sessions for people who have tried it or have, dipped their toes into the water. And it's separated now, so the high school folks are separated from the university folks, which I think is great. And it's STEM, it's not just math, even though a lot of math folks organize it. So it's a couple days, or I think the first weekend in June. So it's only $10, and if you can't afford that, send us an email and we'll waiver that for you. It's a bargain.
Sounds good, and it's virtual. Is it virtual?
Yes.
Okay, good, because who knows when vaccines will make it here.
Yep.
Actually, really quick talk before we go. Have you heard anything about AAPT being virtual? I'm assuming it's the case. Still
they have still not decided officially. There was you may have seen an email there was a fill out this survey email, which basically was have you been vaccinated? Are you willing to travel to Washington, D.C.? Would you stay at the hotel? Those were the questions.
Oh.
So I think they're trying to gather some data to give back to the hotel to get out of their contract. That's my impression. I don't know anything official though.
Gotcha. Okay. I just thought I'd ask since I had the opportunity.
That was my my impression from stuff I'd heard too, that AAPT was trying to get the contract.
Yeah.
And if they could, then it'll be virtual. If they can't get out of the contract, they may just go ahead with it. But it's hard to answer, right? I mean, I live in the area, so I was like, well, yeah, I would go, except I don't know if I'm going to be vaccinated by then.
Yeah. Well, and for me, it was easy. I'm already fully vaccinated thanks to the governor of Nevada, frankly. But
yes. All right. Thanks,
Just
guys.
stop recording or something.
Yeah.
Bye.
See you
Much
guys. Thank you.
everyone.